The title of this webinar is How to Run a SaaS Pricing Project. And it's actually sort of slightly off because I'm just going to talk about how I run a SaaS pricing project and the methodology that I have developed. It is also the 6th out of a series of 6 webinars on B2B SaaS pricing overall. So my name is Ulrik Schmidt, and I'm a B2B SaaS pricing consultant, and I've been so for about 7 years. I work solo as an advisor to SaaS companies of all sizes. Usually the range of companies I serve are between 10 million ARR US to a couple of billion of ARR, but usually the range is sort of from 10 million to a couple of 100 million. And I've run around, I usually say 150 pricing projects, which probably is true, maybe a little bit more. Some of them have been sort of shorter engagements and others have been sort of spanning multiple years. So the other webinars have been in the sort of preceding 6 weeks or so. I think we started late August 21st with packaging, then pricing models and so forth. And all of these recordings and the slides can be found in the school community. So it's school with a k.com/SaaS-pricing/about. You can get access there. And we started actually the community at the same time as I started the first webinar. So it's only sort of 6 weeks in, and we're about 450 people, I think actually a little bit more now. All sorts of like pricing professionals, product people, commercial people, founders and C-level executives discussing pricing and monetization in different versions. And that's awesome. So I've also chosen that to let that be the way where I sort of publish these webinars, have the recordings, have the slides, all of that. And of course, any discussion that we don't have time for here, we'll go have it in there. So what I will cover today is I will give you an overview of the process I've developed to run these pricing projects. And then I'll sort of go through it a little bit. So then I'll say, okay, so how do you measure, or how do I measure whether a B2B SaaS company has untapped pricing power? I'll describe how I do competitor research. I'll describe how I run some of the modeling to set prices across types and sizes of customers, at least some of the ways I do that. Then I'll describe how I validate new pricing before launch, how I migrate legacy customers to new pricing. And then, I say 10, 20 minutes of Ask Me Anything. Hopefully we'll get sort of 20 to 30 minutes of Ask Me Anything. Overview of the process. My, let's say, main intuition and maybe contribution to SaaS pricing overall is that I think that it's more a design exercise than I think it's a spreadsheet exercise. And a lot of pricing professionals have this approach that pricing is a numbers game. And it is. Like, pricing is about making money and, let's say, approaching your market with the right kind of strategy for sort of volume or premium. But more than something that can be solved in an Excel sheet, it is something that needs to be solved from a design and functionality perspective, and also something that needs to be solved from an, let's say, risk-taking and emotional perspective in the team of people that have to make the decisions. So if you are an executive of a SaaS company, or you otherwise have control over the pricing process, then what will usually happen when a consultant comes to you and say, I have a spreadsheet and we've done some market research and we did some interviews and so forth, and I think that you can raise prices 600%. You're probably going to be skeptical, and rightly so, because if it isn't true that you can raise 600%, if there was an error or some kind of imprecision or an assumption that was wrong in this analysis, then you have to deal with the outcome, which probably is going to be terrible if you're wrong. So with that realization, and having done sort of the first couple of dozens of projects for my clients, I thought, how can I approach this sort of major issue, which is sort of the sense of risk inside a project? So essentially, I sort of asked the question, like, what needs to happen in order for an executive team or a CEO to make the call and execute on a large price increase for the most key accounts that he or she has? And I'm using an example here of 600% because I actually sort of first formalized the process with an IoT platform where we were raising prices 600% for the largest accounts. I thought, it's okay, in order to do this, we need to sort of incrementally approach this risk. And so I'll show you sort of the reverse format of this. So imagine this, like we have a number of customers, 5 of them are the largest ones. And then what would need to happen for us to raise prices for those? So if that is the end game, 600% on the top 5 accounts. Then I would say that I would do that and be confident to do that if I had just raised 600% on my, let's say, 25 second largest accounts, right? So for whatever, like if that was possible and I had just executed that, then probably I would also have the confidence to do it for my 5 largest accounts. And then of course the question just moves. It just says, okay, so what needs to then happen for you to raise the prices for the 25 second largest accounts? Well, maybe you have raised them for everyone else, like all of the smaller accounts, sort of the long tail of accounts that you have. So if you first raise for the long tail, then you can raise for the kind of large ones, and then you end up raising for the largest ones. But of course, then that also just moves the question. So now you have to ask, well, what would make you confident enough to raise prices for your smallest customers? And well, maybe if you had just executed this price increase in new sales, so you actually just took the price to market, sold new customers on the large price, that succeeded. So now you take the smallest customers, roll them over, then semi-large ones, and then finally the largest ones. Again, what would make you confident enough to try something in new sales? Well, maybe you just validated the pricing in customer interviews and gotten sort of strong feedback that they actually like the new packaging, like the new pricing. And to do that, maybe you just validated internally with your own employees, so your product teams, your sales teams, your CS teams, and so forth, that the sketch you have is really strong. And then finally, where it all begins is in the key management team, where the design actually happens and the decision there. So it can be the absolutely sort of same framework or design that originates in the key management team, but by going through these series of steps of validation, new sales, and then sort of a phased migration of existing accounts, you solve for risk, as I call it, in incremental fashion to allow yourself the confidence and the, let's say, maximal aggression that might be possible in your market. So if you split it out into sort of project phases, it looks something like this. You have a design phase, you have a validation phase, you have a sales test, new customers, and then you have what I call a rollback or a migration phase where you apply the new framework to existing customers. And from a time perspective, in my experience, usually the design phase is about 1 to 4 weeks. So you need to sort of have some iterations and take the key management group through some spreadsheets and some PowerPoints and some whiteboard exercises and conversations to end up with a good design. And then you need to run some validation, internal and external, so interviews with customers, town hall with internal teams and so forth, usually 2 to 6 weeks. Sales test, usually a sales cycle. If you have a very long sales cycle, you can also get it done faster and usually about 3 months. But about sort of 3 to 6 months is usually what I set aside for a sales test. And then the migration of existing customers is usually a contract cycle. So a year if in most B2B SaaS. So that's sort of the framework that I use. And sort of with some differences in some projects, this is sort of the template approach or progression I use to solve most of my client issues. So if we then take that and then ask, okay, so what does that mean from an organizational perspective? So in each of the different sort of functions that I have in the organization, I just provided sort of this overview. And you'll get the slides later if you go to the school group, so you can sort of study it more, let's say in detail, because I don't want to sort of read through all the fine print here, but I just want to sort of have a few sort of touch points in this. So essentially you have the different sort of types of stakeholders. So you have the core team. That's a group of executives, someone from sales or marketing or both, and then someone from product. And then you can have CS represented. You can have finance represented. In small organizations, you have usually the CEO, the founders there, but it's a group of about 4 to 5 people that have different perspectives on the customer and are able to bring those perspectives into a room and then decide on pricing and packaging. That's it, right? Don't have more people. It just slows things down. So 4 to 5, ideal size. They need to be, let's say, also the champions of this once the designs are completed and able to carry it into the rest of the organization. So person from sales, carry it into sales, person from product, carry it into product, and so forth. Usually you'd have a project manager. They have to spend about 30 to 50% of their time in the design phase. An analyst, that's the person who does the spreadsheets, the same. Product teams, sales teams, marketing, CS, finance, and other have very little to do in the design phase. Next phase is the validation phase. Now we see that, the roles shift, the load shift. So analyst has less work. Sales team starts to now participate in internal validation, and other people then from across the organization start to also let's say, ramp up ahead of implementation and so forth. Sometimes we see a gap if the product needs to catch up, if you make major product changes, where you just need to sort of stand still for a while sort of development happens before you then move into a sales test, which is, of course, let's say, heavily loaded on sales, right? All the other sort of parts of the organization, CS, finance, and so forth, they have to support the sales motion and, let's say, carry, sometimes in a manual way, the sale of the new product, let's say with billing flow and with customer support requests and so forth. But that's about the idea. Sales have a big role here. And then, of course, in migration of legacy customers, we're back to sometimes for key accounts, top management, but otherwise it's customer success and sales who sort of drive most of the work in renegotiating and renewing from old pricing to new. So that's the overall framework. And here we have all of it without anything grayed out. So going from there, I just want to sort of touch on how to measure the untapped pricing power. So just to say, okay, should we even start a pricing project? So the idea would be sometimes you have strategic issues. Sometimes you bought a competitor and you need to sort of merge two products. And that's when you actually start a pricing project. But most of the times it's because you feel that you're leaving money on the table. For these next couple of sessions or sections of the webinar, I'm going to go over it a little quickly because I touched on several of these topics in some of the previous webinars. So if you feel completely lost in some of these sections, go review those recordings or review those slides. But I'll go over it here just because I think it fits very well overall. So first is with untapped pricing power, two methods: potential versus actual. So figuring out the existing model, how well it actually monetizes existing customers. And then we can also triangulate versus alternatives. So you could say one is an internal evaluation method and another is an external evaluation method. So the internal one is simply what I went over in the last webinar, which is the expansion cube. So this is the idea that your existing customers might be stuck on not enough of the product. So they might be on a too lower tier. They're only buying the basic tier and they should buy the advanced, and they're not buying enough add-ons or whatever it is. And maybe also they are not using enough of the volume. They only have a few users and they should have more, whatever it is. And maybe you just have this sense that they're not, maybe some of them paying what they should. So there's just money left on the table. And if you just try to estimate each of these parameters, they actually multiply. So I used this case also last week. If you have a 100 million ARR company, which is an actual customer case I have, where you estimate that customers on average have then you actually end up with a $357 million potential instead of the 100 million actual that you have. And then the pricing project becomes relevant if you think you can execute some of that, right? So if you can execute half of each of these and have 10% churn, then you can still lift the 100 million to 157. So that's the idea. From the triangulation point of view, it's trying to look at different, let's say, spreadsheet segmentation versions of your customers. So this is a type of analysis that I do a lot, and I'll just walk you through it a little bit. This is another case that I did. This is a returns management product, so an e-commerce tech product. They do about 5.5 million in ARR actual. And I just want to focus in on a few parts of this analysis here. So the first thing that we see here is that we have 2,233 accounts. So that's number of customers. And they bring in 5.6 million of ARR today. That's the actual executed price that we have today. And what I often do in order to segment customers when evaluating pricing power or if we're off in some way, is that I just rank order all these customers from like highest ARR to lowest. And then I just take 25% of ARR in 4 quartiles. So in this case, we have 18 customers that together constitute 1.4 million of ARR. Then we have 88 customers that are the next largest 1.4 million of ARR, all the way down to the smallest customers, 1,867 customers that are 1.4 million of ARR. So here we have a 100x difference where we have 1,800 customers in the lowest quartile and we have 18 customers in the highest quartile, each paying us the same amount of money, right? So this is just a way to segment customers. I call it natural segmentation that is really helpful because each segment has equal weight. Like they're just from an ARR perspective of the same size. So now we can say, okay, so these small customers bring in the same money as these large ones. And then we can start to have a more apples to apples comparison as opposed to just having like a small, medium, large type segmentation. So that's sort of the first step. The second step is to then say, well, how is volume distributed across these customers? So they pay us the same, but on the main metric, in this case, returned e-commerce orders, we can see that the largest accounts have about twice as many returns as the smallest ones. So since they pay us the same money, we can then conclude that the price per return is about half. So we actually sort of give around a 50% discount from, let's say, low volume customers to high volume customers in this market. Maybe that's okay. But then we take a look at some of the competitors, and I'll go over in a minute how I find these prices and how I extract competitor pricing. And then we can see that the two main competitors of this client of mine actually would have priced the same 2,200 customers that we have, 20 and 30 million respectively. And then we can see, okay, so to what degree is this then differentiated across these different number of returns? And we can see, are any one of our competitors maybe giving more or less discount on the returns than we are? Like, are they considering volume to be as big of a price driver as we are? And we can see both of these competitors are not giving the same discount to the high volume returns that we are, because they're not pricing it the same, right? So they're only giving about a 40% or so discount to the highest number of returns. So we can see that we're, one, priced off market compared to the competitors. And then two, we can also see that we are giving too much away on the high volume, even within the consistency of our own price list to the largest accounts. So it's just a really nice way to try to get a sense of what the potential is and what the implicit assumptions are in the pricing that we have managed to execute so far. And then, of course, we can also say, how is this comparing to the actual list prices we have? Because you might find, and this was the case with this client, that the actual prices that we execute are very different from the list prices that we, ideally would execute. And so in this case, actually, the list price was quite linear, and we had a sales team that just were, giving away, especially to larger accounts, very extreme discounts, because there were no structural discounts built into the model from the get-go, which was part of the problem, that they just were, say, left to their own demise, in a sense, to just figure out what the largest accounts were willing to pay. And they just overreacted to the pressure that they got, because they lacked a system to give sensible discounts. So that and the expansion cube are the two ways I use to gauge whether there is pricing power. So the way that I do the competitor research is relatively straightforward. And I don't know why not more people do it in B2B SaaS. And sort of my simple method is simply that I mystery shop the competitors. So if you have a competitor, and especially if you're in a space where the price point is below, let's say 10K, just go and buy your competitor's software. Like, literally go through a buying process and just buy it, and just figure out, can you get a discount? What kind of service do you get? How quickly do they respond? What's the pricing model? What does that professional services cost? And so forth. Like, just having that experience can be eye-opening. And if the price point is considerably higher, let's say 20K, 50K, 100K, million, then you can just go through a pretend RFP process, so request for proposal process, and sort of go, let's say, pretty long into a sales cycle, but without, of course, actually buying. And so here you basically see a description of the way that I mystery shop competitors on behalf of my clients. So what I do is I just call up the competitors and saying, I am a consultant working on behalf of a client. And then I come up with a fake case based off of one of my client's largest customers. So if my client runs the return software, I find one of the largest brands that he serves. And then I say, okay, I'm a large European fashion brand. I do whatever, 1 million online orders a year, and I need to handle X many returns. What can you do for me? And then I just simply go through the process, ask them what their pricing is, how their onboarding works, what kind of professional services they have, what direction they're going to take their product in the future. I ask what happens if my volume drops, what happens if my volume increases. And I ask what happens if I want to start testing out the product on just one of my brands, so a very sort of local and small purchase. And then in that way, I get both the small purchase, let's say small account, my quartile 4 account, and also I get my quartile 1, my absolute largest XL account, prices for both. And since I have the model, let's say price per return, then I'm usually able to extract something like just a table format for how their pricing actually works. So in this case, This is sort of the actual research from these two competitors. It's like the fee is a certain number of returns from 10,000 to 250,000. And then we have an actual amount. It's a price per return. We just infer a discount. And then we're just able to, in the next step, just take this pricing and just apply it across all of our existing customers. So our own customers, and say, hey, we have these customers. So if in this example, this particular customer that pays us 129K today for their 1.9 million returns, they're a fashion and accessory brand. If they were to go to Return Go or Loop Returns, they would pay either 1.1 or 1.5 million respectively. And that's sort of the gap that we have. So even on this one account, we can find another million in ARR, assuming that they don't churn. So we can say, okay, the next step would then be how good is our product compared to these competitors? But if we are as good or better, then this customer is not going to churn out of the market and just do this in an Excel sheet. They're going to turn to a competitor. And if those competitors are worse and higher priced, they're going to stay. So we can actually 8x or 10x the pricing on this account without any risk of churn. So it is a real powerful tool to do. Some of the most aggressive price increases I have ever done have been off of the back of competitor research, because there's just nothing more motivating for an executive team than just seeing something like this, where, they're pricing 5 million and their closest competitors charging the same customers 20, or would charge them 20. That is just a really powerful motivator to just 3x your pricing without hesitation, or with very little hesitation, or actually at least go to the next step where you then validate and test. So that is also exactly how I set prices across types and sizes of customers. The first is to determine what I call price positioning at each segment. And I just want to showcase you what I mean here. So I actually don't do a lot of Westendorf. I don't do a lot of conjoint analysis. I don't do a lot of A/B split testing. And the only reason I don't do a lot of those things is that my customers usually have lower volume. So I usually work in the 25K plus ACV, where we don't have tens of thousands of customers. So it's just really, really difficult to do any kind of meaningful data analytics on A/B split testing on lower volume of customers. If your next year is really good, if you get 20 new logos, you're not going to A/B split test that with any kind of certainty. So, and then also each of the deliveries on the product and sort of the composition of those accounts is just going to be so different that it's just going to be hard to get any learning from. So what I do instead is I say, okay, so how do we position across rough segmentations or sizes of customers against the competitors? And then we work the model, what I call top down and bottom up, is that we see if the pricing we have makes sense. So I just want to illustrate that. So price positioning simply works like this. So you see here the ARR new, where you have the little red box. We sort of decide that we want to price this segment of customers something like 4 million. So we price them 1.4 today. We want to go to 4. The idea being that the competitors would price them at 5.4 and 7.5. And we want to be super competitive in this segment. So we position like way lower. And then for the next two quartiles, quartile 2 and 3, we want to price at roughly a little under 5. And that actually is more in line with Return Go, the closest competitor. So we actually just want to price on par. So we don't want to be higher. We also don't want to be lower. We just want to match the closest competitor here. And then for the smallest segment, we want to go to 6 million, because we actually feel that we can be sort of higher than the closest competitor here and actually be a little bit more premium on this, because we feel we have a much stronger proposition from a product perspective. And that's just the direction we want to go. So I think thinking in terms of like bulk pricing for whole segments is a really good way to go about this. And then recreating the actual pricing model in terms of what does that mean in terms of flat fees and price per return and discount tranches and so forth. You'll just rework that until you get these overall numbers. And then that's what I mean with top down and bottom up. So top down and bottom up essentially is to rework numbers until you get the right total prices for the segments. And then also you can go into an individual account level and say, for this account that today pays 129K, if they got to, let's say, 1 million, do we still think it makes sense? Could we actually get this account to pay this money, given the competitive situation, given the product positioning and so forth? And if the answer is yes, then the bottom up makes sense. And if the overall numbers for ARR new goes to 4, 5, 5, and 6 million for these quartiles, then it also makes sense. And then the outcome result, as you see here, is that we're targeting a price increase from 5.6 million for ARR actual to ARR new just under 20 million, so 19.9. So this would be a 3.5x increase overall in a case like this. That's the approach here. So if you then have this 3.5x increase, and the spreadsheet says yes, and you have the competitors research done and all this. I think you're now at a point, if we go back to the process here, where you have done all of the design, like you're done with the design phase, but you're still missing you still don't know if you missed something. So before you just go to your largest accounts and take that one account at 129 and say, hey, you got to pay $1 million, maybe you want to do a few extra steps to just make sure that you got it right. And especially if you're doing more structural changes, like you're changing package radically, and maybe you're changing the pricing model to something else, you want to make sure that what you have actually makes sense for your market. So that's why we have the validation and we have the sales test. So design is what you arrive at this point, and then you go into the validation steps as the next one. Validation, in my book, is two things: internal validation and external validation. Internal validation is relatively simple. It's just throwing different town halls. So you get people together or have them in a call, and then you show them the new pricing. And you say, hey, we, the core team, the management team, we have been in the ivory tower. We have this spreadsheet. It says that we can take our pricing and 3.5x it. This is the reasoning. We think the packaging should be whatever, good, better, best, 2 add-ons. We should price per user, whatever we have. Like, this is the new model. What do you think? And what would this mean if you had to execute this tomorrow? Like, if we just asked you to implement it straight away, what kind of roadblocks would you hit in your function? And then you have CS and sales and finance and development and all these sort of chip in. And then all the feedback you get from these conversations, you put into 4 buckets: communication, decisions, issues, and good ideas. Of course, people can just say, that makes total sense. No problem. We're just going to do it. That's great. Like, no need to do anything. But if there is an issue, it is a very high chance that it is actually not an issue with the model you created. It's just an issue with the way you're explaining it. So that's a communication issue. So you just need to be clearer in the way you tell the story and the way you explain the new packaging and pricing. So if that's the issue, just fix the communication, but let everything else be. There might also be something that just requires you to make a decision. So let's say sales comes and say, well, how do we build this particular thing? And you say, well, good question. We haven't thought of that yet. It's not a problem. We just need to make a decision. Maybe we do it like we did it yesterday, but you just need to make that decision and then you make it. You can also delegate it to the person who asked the question, which is sort of a good trick, but otherwise you just move forward. But there will be things that you haven't thought of at this point and you just need to think of them, but they're not taking you a step back. It's just more work that you just get to now. Third, you can have issues. Issues are the things that people bring up something and you need to take a step back. So it might be, this way of, the reporting product that we had thought about is illegal due to GDPR, whatever, right? So you say, okay, that's a problem. We need to cancel that add-on, or we need to sort of rethink the way that we're structuring it so that it is legal. So an issue is something you need to change. And finally, of course, people can have good ideas and then you implement those. But very importantly, for internal validation, you don't ask people for good ideas, because you don't want to open up the discussion. You want to close it down. You want to say, we have a design, please validate it, as opposed to, what do you think our new pricing and packaging should be? Because that last question will never end. That's just an internal discussion. But it's much easier for you to actually have a very concrete suggestion and then get people to figure out how it's going to work in practice within their domain. That's a much more answerable question, and it's going to get you further faster. But of course, if they have a great idea, listen. External validation, you call a handful of customers, 5 to 10, here I say 5 to 6, sit them down for an interview, about 45 to 60 minutes, and just get their feedback. I'm just going to walk you through how I do that. The way that I have these validation interviews with customers is, I think, one of the key ingredients to the success I've had in my projects. And it's simply because the way I structure these interviews make it very, very hard, if we get the right kind of feedback, to accidentally launch a product that isn't good. And the reason is that we showcase the pricing and packaging in a sequenced way so that we get the feedback where it is useful to us. And the structure is as follows. And I call it the traffic light model of validation interviews. Actually, when I send out the slides, I actually have a template for validation interviews that you can just steal. So do that. But I'm just going to go through it high level here first. So the idea is that we first show them the unique selling proposition that we have. So that might be, we handle returns for large e-commerce companies to reduce costs. And if that's the case, then they either say, we get it, we agree, or they say, why are you telling us that? We have no interest in this. So it's like a green light or it's a red light. So it's either go or don't go. If it's a green light, you go on. If it's a red light, you don't need to show them the rest of the presentation. Like if they're not buying your USP or your general reason for existing, there's no reason for you to validate the rest of the offering with them because they have no interest in buying. So the idea is that it's sort of a milestone, a gated approach where you start by asking the most fundamental question first. And if they say, great, we love it, then you ask the next question. But if they don't love it, you just pause there and figure out why until you can solve it so that you can go on. The next question would be fencing. That's, let's say you sell to two different types of customers. Let's say you sell to farmers and fishermen, and they say, hey, we're doing this. Do you know which one you are? And then the farmer says, I get it. I'm a farmer. Great. So they understand it. They think it's a great way to whatever separate your product. And then that can be red, yellow, or green, right? Packaging is, you say, I have these tiers, I have these modules, I have these add-ons. Do you understand what I try to sell you? Is it something that you'd like to potentially buy? Again, green, yellow, or red. And then that is separated from the pricing. And importantly so, because if they don't like the packaging, they're not going to like the pricing. But if you show them both things at the same time, like basic, advanced, enterprise with price points and the whole thing, if they don't like the packaging, they're just going to say, oh, it sounds too expensive. So the feedback you're going to get if you show everything at once is just going to be really hard for you to use to determine where the problem actually is. But if you just show them the packaging and just say, just assume the price is fair, they will give you feedback on the packaging and say, I love it, or I hate it, or I don't understand it, or I understand it. But if they say, I think it makes total sense, I'm probably in the advanced tier with no add-ons, now you're game. Then you can show the model, say, hey, we price per user upfront. How do you like that? And if they say, that makes total sense, I love being priced per user upfront for this type of software, go ahead. Then you can show them the price points and say, the pricing makes total sense for us. $100 per user per month is, reasonable for this, and so forth. And then the traffic light model gives you an overview like this, where you go through a bunch of customers and just map it out, green, yellow, red, and you just get an overview with some notes. And then you can say, okay, so we have 5 customers here. Like a few of them got all green lights. So they loved it. That's great. Like maybe if they get green lights at price points, which is too cheap, but we have one company here, Mega Inc. They, didn't get the USP. And so maybe the ICP that we're looking for. Then we had another customer, they sort of didn't get the packaging. They had a use case that were limited. They only wanted some of the features. And that then is useful for you so that you go back and fix it. And then the next time around, you actually cut out Mega Inc. from the group of customers you even want to talk to because you just decide not to do it. And then you fix the packaging issue and go back to Widget Co. and then revalidate it until you get a result like this. And if you get a result like this, I have never seen a product fail in the market, even though you only do 5 to 10 interviews. Because the method of validating like this is so powerful that whenever there is something that is not going to work, you have a way for them to tell you. The last thing I want to talk about is how to migrate customers from the old pricing to the new. And my approach is relatively simple. So let's say that we're at the point where you decided to 3.5x your pricing and you validated with customers and you got the right traffic light model and you pushed it out into new sales and the customers in the market are actually buying at these new prices with the new packaging. Okay, great. Now you need to go back to the existing customers and tell them that prices are going to 3.5x. And for some customers, like 29,000 customer, maybe they're going to 8x, right? So regardless of whether that's fair and whether the market accepts it, it's still not a nice situation. And we want to mitigate the risk a little bit. And my approach here is to start with the easy ones first, right? So if you remember, I didn't go to the 5 top accounts to begin with. I started with the long tail, then moved to the medium accounts, and then did the large accounts at the end. And I think that's the right way to do it. So you want to start with some easy wins where you can change pricing and get some customers over without too much of a battle. So do that and then do it in steps. So if you have, let's say, 10 million of ARR to move, just move like 2 or 3 million at a time, send them the email, handle the customer success calls, like do all the negotiation. And then once it settles down, send the email to the next 3 million of ARR and then go through it in steps. That's just much easier. And then one thing that I often tell executive teams that I work with is that it's always going to be the case that you look at a given customer and say, okay, if I just handle this one customer perfectly and, gave them a call and went for coffee and had lunch and had a series of meetings and did all this, then probably I could, get them to convert. But the problem is that if you have 5,000 customers, you can't have 5,000 lunches, right? So at some point you have what I call an execution budget. So you have a certain amount of time and energy available to do the migration, and actually getting a grasp of that and sort of figuring out, okay, so how much time do we have? Like, how many customers can we handle, let's say, manually? How many customers do we want our CEO to do personally? And how many customers do we want sales to handle implicitly, so that, which is taking up time from new sales? And how many do we want customer success to handle? And how many do we just want to sort of send a take it or leave it email, and they can either churn or stay, but up to them. And then selecting which customers gets handled personally by the CEO, but within the constraints of him or her only doing 5 of them, is a much better approach than just looking at sort of almost like the FOMO that, each and every one, let's say, potentially would do better if handled with full execution. So actually consider that sort of an approach to planning, both the communication, but also the approach you have when migrating customers. And then whenever you want to do something, let's say, more extreme, what happens is that maybe you want to phase it in over a little bit of time. Maybe you have perpetual customers that you want to move to cloud. Maybe you have some perpetual legacy contracts, or you have contracts that, don't give you the right to do a price increase, or you have all sorts of other problems with existing accounts where, it's not that easy. And I just set up a scenario where you have a combination of what I call carrot and stick. So like push and pull. So you give them some value, that's the carrot. And then also you threaten them or reduce some value, that's the stick. So threatening could be, we're going to sunset your product. It says end of life in 12 months or whatever it is, and we're going to stop supporting it, or whatever it is. Or you can just ramp up pricing on the existing legacy product in order to get them to move to the new cloud product, or whatever the scenario might be. So this combination of using carrot and stick, I find to be the most successful. And of course, it's almost like a separate design exercise for how to move these and what the flow actually should be. The rule of thumb is that anything below 50% increase or net 10K, just do it immediately. But anything above a 50% increase or above a 10K increase, you might want to consider phasing it in over 2 or 3 years. For example, here's a snippet from a spreadsheet with actually a Danish customer, where we say, okay, we have about 28 million of current ARR. We want to hit 57 million. So like a doubling of prices. But that is actually what we do in year 3. And then we separate the customers in version 2 and 3 and on-prem. So they have different, let's say, segments. And then we phase it in over a couple of years. So we say, hey, next year we go from 28 to 39 million. And then we go to 51, and then finally to 57 in sort of steps, so that customers aren't, let's say, killed in year 1 on their budgets. But actually we still get to that fully ramped price in 3 years, after which, of course, we can raise prices again in sort of a more normal fashion without doing this big correction here. And for this actual project, we announced new pricing to quartile 2, 3, and 4. So all except the largest customers in September. And then in January, we executed it. In March, we announced the end of life. That's the stick of the enterprise customers. That's sort of the largest one by 2026, and gave them some incentives. And then we're starting to execute those at the beginning of next year, regardless of product version. So that's the framework. So to repeat, process, solve for risk, design, validate, sales test, migration. The pricing power, we had the expansion cube, and we have comparison externally with competitors and other things. Competitor research was mystery shopping. Prices are set by positioning. Where do we want to be on different segments? And this internal top-down, bottom-up exercise. Validation, internal and external with the traffic line model. And then the migration principle of do the easy ones first, and then have a combination of carrot and stick and phase it in over a couple of years. Processes here again: design, validate, test and sales, and then migrate existing customers with the purpose of solving for risk or reducing risk over time. Okay, and now questions. So I see we have about as many people now as when I started, so I'll consider that a good sign. So thank you guys for hanging in. So before I kick off the questions, and I know we only have 10 minutes left, school.com/SaaS pricing/about. Go there, have fun. Your life will be better for it. That's also where you find the recording and the slides. And yeah, so I'll stop repeating the other parts and just get to the questions here. So Casey asks, any additional insights into running mystery shopping research with highly niche products and industries? So mystery shopping it's more sort of price point dependent. So usually anything below a few thousand, that's on their website. You just go find it out, or you can just call them and they're happy to tell you straight away. Between, let's say, 5,000-10,000 and up until, let's say, about 100K, that's usually a relatively simple 1 to 3 week, I'll call you, have a couple of meetings, RFP type process, and then you get what you need. More than 100K can be difficult. Like that's usually, I have about let's say a 50% success rate, maybe a little bit more on those accounts. Like it's just, and it's simply because the sales process is just too long. Too many people involved. They sometimes get stuck in not being able to scope out very technically the exact quote and so forth. So, but other than that, I have done a lot of highly niched products and highly niched industries with mystery shopping, and I don't see any structural difference there, to be honest. Jose asks, do you do the price positioning exercise, the quartile per fence or across the board? Yeah, definitely per fence. So, and actually what I didn't show you is that sometimes I do the positioning per the quartiles, sometimes I do them per other segmentations, and sometimes I do a little bit all of it in order to sort of have it internally make sense, right? So let's say you can also do the positioning in the channel. You can do it based on geography. You can do it based on vertical. You can do it and so forth. Like, doesn't really matter. It's more like, what is the relevant comparison here that you have? And maybe many of them are relevant. And then you need to sort of position across multiple points and just find the right balance between all of those. Jesper asks if in the pricing examples, you show there is a big gap between current pricing and competitor pricing. If product is comparable, it seems easy to raise prices as customers cannot get the product by churning and moving to the competitor. What if prices are much closer? What tactics should we use to raise prices? So one thing that you'll see is that sometimes your prices are closer on some segments, let's say some quartiles, and on others, they're way off. So I have a customer right now where actually we are lowering prices for quartile 4, the small customers, which is like 80% of the customers. And then we're raising them considerably for quartile 1 and 2. Both are fine, right? So because we actually have high churn on quartile 4, so we're hoping to address that. So actually this can be a useful way to just like balance out your pricing with whatever you think the market is there. The rest of it would be that sometimes you say it can be hard to find apples to apples comparisons with competitors. So sometimes let's say half of your product does all of what the competitors do. And then you have sort of another half that does another use case and brings other value. Then I would actually do the price positioning based on only what I call comparable product. So I would just do sort of half of my product, make that match the competitors, and then try to build sort of a value case for the rest in some way and say, hey, that's another 10, 50, 200% price on top, depending on what the case actually is and what it does in addition. So it has a lot to do with that. But then the argument here would also be that you don't have competitors. So it's actually that part of your offering, you have a blue ocean, right? So you also get to sort of discover what the pricing power for that is. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers the questions here. Okay, so let's do sort of the last case on that. If you have a very comparable product to your competitors and you're just like very much on par with them on pricing, then maybe you don't want to change prices that much, right? Maybe you just want to make sure that you are internally aligned with your own price list and you're giving sort of better structural discounts. You clean up the packaging a little bit. Maybe you need to sort of change the model to something that, is easier for customers to buy, or it's easier for them to expand. But the project hasn't gotten as a main objective now to just raise prices. Maybe you're just removing friction, or you're making it easier to narrate or buy in some way. And the numbers stay relatively the same. I mean, that can still be a very good outcome for you. It's just not short-term monetization of your user base. It's just maybe a long-term more, so let's say, a better way to be in the market and to sell your product. And that's then the game in the pricing project instead. So of course, that's also an outcome. We're not always raising prices. Sometimes we're doing other things. And sometimes, of course, we're also lowering them. Clay asks here, are there any legal, ethical elements to consider when conducting mystery shopping research? Yes, of course. So for example, you will sometimes be asked to sign NDAs. If you want to sign them and go ahead, that's on you. Of course, there are obviously both legal and ethical implications with doing something like that. But otherwise, The ethical implications let everyone up to themselves to navigate. The legal ones, I think you have cases, especially in the US, where there has been very, let's say, extreme mystery shopping to the degree where you had your people hired with the competitor and actually sort of industrial espionage and full on creating shell corporations to buy the products of the competitors and do these things. Some of these have actually been fined in court. So definitely there are limitations to what you can do. I think the only thing I can say is that if in doubt, ask your lawyer. I can say that I conduct these globally. I sleep well at night, and yeah. But that's of course on me. So please make your own decisions on that. Jose asks, also, would you exclude outliers in terms of size, volume, or old pricing from the analysis? And would you run the analysis based on the last rolling 12 months to reflect the latest prices? So this is actually what I do when I compare actual prices to list prices. This is actually where I have the gap between what we actually charge customers and what we would charge those customers if they became customers today with current pricing. So the gap that we had between, let's see if I can find one of these slides here. Here, ARR actual and ARR list is actually often the gap we see from either discounts or grandfather, right? And if that gap is large, sometimes what we do in a pricing project is just close that, right? And then we have it, like in this case, we would have a win of about 2.5 million. And, we would still be well within the parameters of the competitors. And that will probably be faster and easier to execute. So we can just do that. So based on the legacy cohorts, I would just make that analysis. And then you ask about outliers. So if you have outliers, that is actually often sometimes where you have the most pricing power, right? So let's say that you usually charge between 5 and 50 users. That's your regular account. And let's say you also sell to IKEA with 300,000 users. The chance that you're off in your IKEA pricing is pretty good because you have no experience, you have no benchmarks, you have nothing to price IKEA, and you probably really wanted IKEA as a customer when you sold them. So maybe you could double or triple those prices. IKEA is a tough negotiator, so maybe you couldn't, right? But you get my point, is that if you can raise prices considerably on an outlier, usually you also get outlier results. And even so, for example, we had this one account here where you have 1.9 million returns, and they actually would give 1 million. So that is more than 5, maybe even 7% of the entire price increase just from this one account out of 2,000, right? So I think actually outliers have a very specific role where you should consider them even more carefully than the normal spectrum, because the outliers is often where you also found the most sort of untapped power in order to create some change. Steven asks, any thoughts on doing validation interviews with existing customers versus prospects versus churn customers? Yes. So I actually do it most with existing customers. Prospective customers, they just can't ignore that you're trying to sell them something, right? So you can do it also actually with channel partners like resellers and sales partners. They are actually great to do this kind of work with. But existing customers usually are like the go-to source of information. They will be anchored to your current pricing, right? So you have to sort of ignore that fact. So if existing customers say, we like everything except that the price is too high because it's way higher than what I paid today, but those prices that you're suggesting is sort of in line with what you see in the market, just ignore that. Like, it's fine. But you can explain to them product packaging and pricing model and so forth and get much better feedback than any of the other types of customers. Churned customers, double-edged sword. Maybe they churned because they weren't a good fit for your product. So just be very aware that if you do interview them, like if you get a red light from them in one of the things, like it's a definitely sort of block to the interview. Like they're not going to give you any good feedback because likely they are, like it's very few customers that churn just because of price. Like most churn because of lack of value or lack of fit in some way. Alex says, great webinar. Thank you. Great. Jose, sound us off. Okay. You resolved it. And then Dennis with the last question right at 4:00 here. When migrating current large customers, you typically will have some churn and some will resist and will get some discounts versus the target price increase. How much do you usually achieve? What I decide to achieve. So I think what I haven't gone into here is that I sometimes create what I call a stickiness score. So it's almost like a reverse churn risk analysis. And then I map out how sticky I think certain customers are and how big of a price increase they can potentially get. And then I use that to, let's say, if the analysis says, oh, we should 10x prices, and maybe that's good for new customers, but we just think that some of the legacy customers we have, they're just never going to say yes to that, even if we phase it in over 3 years. Then we do a churn risk analysis, and then we say, okay, maybe some of them can do like 7x, maybe some of them can only do 2x, whatever it is. depending on how likely they are to churn. And then we use that analysis to then individualize pricing across all the large accounts and then phase them in to that, let's say, individual price point, but it's based on a structural churn analysis. So I know that, hopefully high level that makes sense, but that's sort of the approach here. And then we execute that sort of pretty hard. Okay, thank you so much, guys. School community for recordings and slides. My book, The Pricing Roadmap, I think it actually just crossed 100 reviews on Amazon. So pretty happy about that. This was also the last of actually the first webinars I had. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I know a few of you have been to all of them. I appreciate that very much. I hope I have given you value in exchange for your time. So thank you so much and good luck with your pricing project. See you out there. Cheers.